Historically, Americans have been called to be the keepers of the flame of liberty, and that liberty depends on innovative thinkers, the free exchange of ideas, and people with a can-do spirit.
The flame of freedom speaks, the flame of freedom within each heart, the flame of freedom saith unto all.
Elizabeth Clare Prophet, noted author, lecturer, educator, and religious leader, interviews revolutionaries in every field who provide the missing dimension to the news that affects you. The forum you are about to see was filmed before thousands assembled at the Royal Teton Ranch in Park County, Montana. Here, in a secluded valley in the heart of the Northern Rockies, concerned citizens of the world gather each summer to attend an international conference for spiritual freedom. They commune with life, meet old friends and new, and hear the flame of freedom that speaks through Elizabeth Clare Prophet and her guests at Summit University Forum. This week, Mrs. Prophet interviews Edwin N. York, authority on nuclear weapons effects and shelters. Their topic, how to survive a nuclear war.
Welcome to Summit University Forum, where the flame of freedom speaks. I am Elizabeth Clare Prophet. Many Americans believe that it is impossible to survive nuclear war. Yet the Soviets, the Chinese, the Swiss, and the Swedes disagree. They have built massive civil defense networks. Can you survive a nuclear war? Will it be worth surviving? Here to help us answer these questions is one of the foremost authorities on nuclear weapons effects and shelters, Edwin N. York. Mr. York has a master's degree in physics and is a senior research specialist in the physics department at Boeing Aerospace Corporation. Edwin York, welcome to Summit University Forum.
Thank you, Mrs. Prophet. It's a pleasure to be here.
Tell us now, can we survive a nuclear war?
Certainly, if we make some preparations so we're prepared to survive. If you're not prepared, there's a good chance that while you'll survive, you'll never recover to the style of living that we're used to today. But the preparations are not difficult, they're straightforward, and there's been a great deal of past research to help us know what those preparations are.
There are a number of public perceptions about fallout shelters that I'd like to ask you about. For instance, that fallout will kill and poison everything.
That's a great exaggeration. Fallout is harmful, but the total stockpiles of all the nations in the world cannot come close to poisoning the entire planet.
Then they say to survive, you will have to stay in your fallout shelter for months or years.
You do have to stay in fallout shelters for a while, but not as long as many of the people predict. In fact, after a day, you could be out of the shelter for 10 or 20 minutes to make emergency actions. After a couple of days, you could be outside of a shelter for perhaps a half hour. After a week, you can be out of the shelter long enough, 2 to 4 hours, to do useful work in recovery.
Are you in a protective suit when you are taking these forays?
No. All you have to be careful is not getting contaminated dust on your clothing and carrying them back into the shelter with you. Any kind of disposable garment, or just taking care to avoid getting dusty and dirty, and perhaps leaving your shoes at the entrance of the shelter when you come back in.
Another perception is that after you emerge from your shelter, nuclear winter will kill everything.
Nuclear winter was a nice phrase. It caught people's imagination, but there's really no substance to the myth. The the idea of nuclear winter has been publicized a great deal, but in fact, the arsenals of the United States and the USSR are not anyways near sufficient to cause dramatic climate changes. In fact, if there are any climate changes, they will be quite small, perhaps a few degrees warming or cooling. The uncertainties are so great that we're not even certain whether the effects would cause a cooling as predicted by nuclear winter, or in fact a slight warming, which would help crops to grow better.
I'm glad you pointed out the fact that myths are started by scientists, and hopefully they're also finished by scientists. The next perception is that both the US and the USSR have an overkill stockpile.
Overkill is another phrase that has caught the public's imagination. In fact, weapons of both sides, ours and the Russians, are tailored toward specific military targets. And as the accuracy of the weapons have gotten better over the years, the yields have decreased. The reason we decrease the yields is because the smaller warheads are more rugged, easier to deliver, and less costly. So that the arsenals are tailored to go after military targets, and in fact there are not enough warheads on either side to completely target all of the military assets that we would like to destroy.
Now, it's my understanding that the Soviets have prepared to target US military targets, however, that the United States, still under the doctrine of MAD, is targeting Soviet civilian populations.
We assume that the Soviets would be rational in the way they target using their weapons, when in fact we do not know exactly what their aim points are. We assess the worth of our military targets and our ability to retaliate and make the assumption that they would be rational and target those assets. In the same way, in our own targeting, we are very careful to expend weapons only when there is a payoff. And so the United States does not target civilians directly. Unfortunately, many of the military targets are close enough to civilian centers that there is bound to be a great deal of damage to civilians. But the targets themselves are always specific military objectives.
That's a very important point. We have had other speakers tell us to the contrary, and I think that bears noting that you have said that, because I'm sure you have access to correct information. Now, another perception that the public has is that nuclear weapons are mysterious and evil.
Weapons, to some extent, nuclear weapons are mysterious, and that's because we have kept information about them classified. Not many people have the background in nuclear physics or in engineering to understand how the weapons work and what they do. And the classification programs we have used have kept the information away from the general public. So there is a natural inclination to view them as mysterious. They're believed to be evil the same way that anything strange is usually thought to be wrong, dangerous, or evil. Weapons release energy. The energy is beneficial or harmful depending on how the people use it.
Another perception is that nuclear weapons fuel the arms race.
The reason the United States uses nuclear weapons, the reason the Soviets use nuclear weapons, is because they're cheap. They are vastly cheaper than any other method of accomplishing the same military objectives. Since they are cheap, we have been able to provide a suitable defense for much less money than we would have otherwise. As long as the Soviet government is expansionist, we will be required to provide an adequate defense against that. And the nuclear weapons, by being cheaper than alternate means of defense, have let us put a smaller fraction of our resources into the defense budget. From that standpoint, the nuclear weapons have limited the arms race. They've made it much less of a burden on our society than it would have been otherwise.
And finally, the perception that an effective shelter would be prohibitively expensive.
There have been many studies and tests of shelters. Expedient shelters that are effective against fallout can be built for a cost of no more than $50 to $200 of material for each occupant. Good blast shelters that would survive from 50 psi to 200 psi of air blast can be built in place for the neighborhood of $700 to $1,000 per shelter occupant.
That sounds very reasonable and something both the government and private citizens should know.
One way of looking at that, the cost of shelter for a family is about the cost of an automobile.
And an automobile is not going to provide a shelter in time of war. I'm interested in the fact that you worked on the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos during World War II, and that you were the deputy leader of the technical optics group that was responsible for the photography of the first nuclear explosion. I'd like you to describe that event for us and tell us what happened to your film.
Well, the first detonation was spectacular. The descriptions you have read and heard about, if anything, underestimate the dramatic impact when you see your first nuclear fireball. I happened to be one of the Army technicians that were pulled out of the Army and sent to Los Alamos to provide extra laboratory hands for the scientists. I was not a scientist. On the getting ready to photograph the first detonation, we had 60 different types of cameras, many of them duplicated by tens or dozens. On the closest in camera stations, which were 1,000 yards from the blast, we built very strong blast shelters and then surrounded the cameras with lead shields and special lead glass to provide shielding from the prompt radiation. The film survived very nicely. We obtained camera records, good camera records from the close-in cameras. In fact, all of the camera stations survived and we obtained records. The majority of cameras were 10,000 yards from ground zero. There we didn't even need special shielding. We did have blast protection from the cameras, and in fact, the last time I visited the test site a few years ago, the camera bunkers are still there, still one of the artifacts from the first detonation. I was very pleased at the success of the cameras. Some of the films that are shown in documentaries today are taken from the first Trinity shot.
It was exciting to be a part of that moment in history, and yet that moment of discovery of what atomic energy can do brings us to what we're facing today, which is a capacity of a Soviet first strike, and whether or not they may use it, terrorists possessing the bomb, the United States not having raised up a strategic defense even at ground level, and therefore a civilian population that is held hostage to whatever the Soviets might determine to do. Which brings us to your field of expertise, which is civil defense and bomb shelters. So before we get into that, I'd like to show you a film clip of the July 1946 nuclear weapons test at Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific. Get your comments on this.
Bob Farmer has 9 children. All suffer genetic disorders, disorders that he blames on this. Operation Crossroads, a nuclear bomb test conducted in July 1946 at Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific. Bob Farmer was there, 8 miles from ground zero.
But I made sure that I was one of them that got to lay down and press my face against the steel deck. We covered our eyes with our arms, and this one boy sitting to my left after the flash. He said, "Oh my God," Farmer said, "I could see the bones of my arm."
Farmer was a 19-year-old seaman second class stationed on board a Navy target ship. His medical problems began less than a year after he witnessed the blast.
What happens when a nuclear weapon explodes? And please comment on this event.
Well, the film clip we just saw was from the Crossroads Baker shot. This was a 20 kiloton underwater detonation. The device was detonated approximately 100 feet below the surface of the lagoon. The lagoon at that point is about 200 feet deep. This, by the way, was one of the 5 original plutonium bombs. The first one was detonated at Trinity in July of 1945. The second one of the plutonium bombs was detonated over Nagasaki. The third one was Operation Able at Operation Crossroads, which was an airburst. The fourth one was this one you just witnessed. The fifth one of the original 5 was never detonated. It was eventually disassembled, and the plutonium core was made into a bare critical reactor nicknamed Jezebel at Los Alamos, New Mexico. What happens when a weapon detonates? It releases a great deal of energy in a small volume. It's extremely hot. It radiates light. It's a very strong light. The light is brighter than sunlight. And the first thing, if you witness one, will be the intensity of light and the feeling of heat. The comment that the sailor made about seeing the bones in his hand is a optical phenomena that anyone can see. If you hold your hand up and put a flashlight behind it on a dark night, you'll apparently see the bones in your hand. You're not seeing the bones in your hand. The sailor didn't see the bones in his hand. What he saw was the way we observe light through our closed fingers when there's a light behind them. A flashlight on a dark night will show the same phenomena. There are some 200,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and civilians who participated in the various weapon tests. I happen to be one of those 200,000. There's an organization called the Association of Atomic Veterans. I happen to belong to that association also. And this association is trying to prove a causative effect between various medical problems and exposure to the weapons. In fact, for the vast majority of us, the exposures were far too small to cause any kind of medical problem. I probably have as much radiation exposure as the majority of the people who participated. I've accumulated something over 50 rads of radiation exposure on the field tests and in laboratory work that I did, and about twice that much, about 100 rads from medical x-rays during the course of prolonged treatment for an undiagnosed appendicitis. In my own particular case, there is no observable effect whatever of any kind. And the same is true of the 200,000 people who have been participants in the test. Whatever the effects are, they are small. I don't mean to say that they don't occur, perhaps they do, but it is not a major hazard, and the people participating in the test have not suffered excessive risks.
What about the family shown on this clip?
The point that has to be made is whether the problems were directly caused by radiation exposure on the test or not. And that's an impossible trail to follow technically, because similar kinds of problems show up in the general population without those kind of exposures. Now, whether they were in fact caused or not, I don't know, nor does anyone else. But the number of people who have such problems is very small and is not significantly different than the same number in the general population.
Do you think then that the government was irresponsible at the Bikini Atoll concerning the civilians?
Every precaution that was known about the hazards was taken. All the people participating in the test were a safe distance away. There were radiation monitors. And while perhaps some of the people were not clearly briefed ahead of time on the potential dangers, certainly within every organization there were people who had been thoroughly briefed, and who were supposed to make sure that everyone in the unit knew what the hazards were. In fact, the hazards were very minimal. Now, in some cases, people who boarded the ships that had been deluged with radioactive water did achieve measurable doses of radiation. But one of the facts about radiation is you can measure very, very tiny amounts. It's very measurable with the proper instruments, and it's completely undetectable by the normal human senses. And so if you can't feel it, you can't taste it, you can't hear it, you can't see it, and so there's something mysterious about it. But instruments detect even the tiniest amounts. In fact, the radiation dial on my watch will send instruments mad, but it's no health hazard, nor is radioactive dials a health hazard to anyone else.
Tell us then, what is the difference between an air burst and a ground burst?
On a ground burst, the initial fireball, the very hot plasma gases generated by the bomb, intersects the ground. And when it does this, a great amount of soil is churned up into the fireball and mixed with the radioactive debris. This earth, sand, crater material, whatever it is, coated with the radioactive bomb fragments, eventually falls back to the ground in what we call radioactive fallout. In an air burst, the burst is high enough that the initial fireball does not touch the ground. The soil particles don't get mixed into the fireball, and the fallout which comes later on is greatly reduced. In fact, from an air burst, the fallout will not be a medical hazard to anyone.
What then is the electromagnetic pulse?
The prompt radiation from the weapon excites electrons in the air. The movement of these electrons creates a radio frequency signal, which we call the electromagnetic pulse. This pulse travels like any other radio wave pulse travels with the speed of light, and it affects every antenna or every structure that will carry a current. The magnitude of the EMP, electromagnetic pulse, depends on the type of burst. For very high altitude bursts, those just out of the atmosphere, say at a height of 100 miles, the EMP is very strong and covers a very wide area. One burst over the center of the United States will generate a pulse that will be very detectable over the entire United States, and it's strong enough to damage some types of sensitive electronics. The EMP is a very serious problem. It's particularly serious with computers and sensitive electronics. It occurs in every burst. It also occurs in non-nuclear bursts. Every chemical explosion produces a small EMP simply from the movement of the plasma in the Earth's magnetic field. But from nuclear weapons, it's much stronger, much widespread, and is a quite serious problem. It has been studied in great detail, and methods of protecting against it are well known. They've been applied to many military systems here and in Europe. So the magnitude, the methods of describing it, and ways of defending against it are quite well known.
To what degree then do the effects of a nuclear explosion vary with distance, both the fallout and this electromagnetic pulse?
Fallout will occur only from a surface burst or a near surface burst. All right, the fallout will drift downwind, and say from a 1 megaton weapon, the fallout will cover an area of about 1,000 square miles, with enough radiation to be lethal to anyone who insists on standing out in the open and not taking any shelter. The electromagnetic pulse that would accompany a ground burst would seriously affect electronics that were within a few miles of the burst. Generally, at a distance of, say, 10 miles from a surface burst, the electromagnetic pulse is no stronger than normal lightning bursts. And so any electronics that would survive normal lightning storms, and most electronics do, then a surface burst is no more hazardous than lightning, at a distance of, say, 10 miles or more. Closer than that, the EMP effects could be serious. If you have a very high altitude burst above the atmosphere, there is no fallout, no hazard from radiation, but the EM pulse could cover an area of a reasonable fraction of the entire United States. In sensitive electronics, many unprotected computers might be affected.
Now I'd like to ask you about specific kinds of shelters in a moment. But in general, how can one protect oneself from the effects of a nuclear blast?
In looking at what kind of shelter you need, you should start with a priority list of the phenomena that cover the most area. The nuclear fallout from a surface burst covers more area than any other effect. It's also the easiest to protect against. So to protect against fallout, any kind of shielding material will do. If you have a trench in the ground, some kind of cover over it, and can put 2 or 3 feet of dirt on top of your trench, that's perfectly adequate protection against fallout. You have to stay in the trench under the shelter until the fallout has decayed. Basement of a house provides a protection factor of about an order of magnitude. Not as good as a trench, but well worthwhile. The next phenomena to be concerned about is the thermal pulse and fires. The thermal from a 1 megaton weapon will create hazardous amounts of thermal radiation, simply heat, similar to sunburn but much more intense, over an area of perhaps 150 square miles, much less than the fallout covers, but still a very large area. So you need to protect from the line of sight thermal radiation, and any kind of barrier will do that. A wall of a house, if you're behind that, will provide thermal protection. If you're in a trench, it will protect you. Fires can be started by this thermal, and so you need to be able to protect yourself from the fires. This means that you have a way of staying away from where the fires are. That means a shelter away from flammable materials, or an air entrainment system that will cope with the fires around it. Normally, if you simply have an inlet and outlet and can reverse the inlet and the outlet, it's adequate protection from fires. Blast is the most obvious damage, but also the one that covers the least area. So if you want to survive very close to a nuclear detonation, then you need a blast shelter. Designs have been tested and proven that will survive at almost any desired overpressure, from 50 psi to 200 psi or even higher, if you want to take the trouble of making a stronger shelter.
Could you briefly describe the civil defense that the Soviet Union has, or the People's Republic of China, Switzerland, and Sweden?
Probably Switzerland has the best civil defense in the world. The Swiss started a program a number of years ago and required all new construction to provide shelters for the persons occupying that construction. That meant if you build a new house, you had to have a shelter in the house. If you build a shopping center, you had to have a shelter in the shopping center that would accommodate all the expected patrons. If you build a new hospital, you had to have a shelter in the hospital to accommodate the patient. Every school had to have a shelter. Right, this program has been in force long enough years now that perhaps 80% of all the population of Switzerland now have good shelters. In some cases, particularly built up old cities, there was simply no place to put new shelters. And in those cases, the communities are responsible for providing a shelter for all their inhabitants at the nearest available location. Sometimes this is in the nearest mountain. But every other situation in Switzerland, the shelter is at the place of occupancy. The Soviets started a shelter program in earnest slightly later than the Swiss did. They held a competition among all the civil design agencies in the Soviet Union, picked a winner for the shelter design which would best suit the Soviet conditions, made an official assessment of that shelter, approved some 32 modifications to it, and these are the shelters which are built for the general population within the Soviet Union. Their criteria was that every large building had to have a shelter for the occupants. The definition of large is somewhat vague. Normally, if a building is over 5 stories, it will have a shelter for the occupant. So in the apartment buildings, there's generally a shelter in the basement. Sometimes the definition of large, we don't understand what they mean, and one agency, one building may not have a shelter. The building adjacent to it may have a shelter for occupants of both buildings. The Soviet shelters are well designed, well thought out, and fit their particular mix of labor and materials. I have no personal acquaintance with the Swedish shelters. I've read about them and understand they're quite good. Chinese have gone to underground tunnels. Many of their cities have tunnels under the shopping centers, access from many stores, and the tunnels run for miles. And quite often there are small shops, eateries, restaurants inside these tunnels which are under the cities. Some of my friends have toured through these tunnels and are very impressed with the ease of access, the number of people that can get into them very quickly. In many of the towns and cities, every little shop has a inside door and a ladder or stairs leading down to this tunnel system.
I understand that was Mao's idea.
So I've been told, yes.
About how much money have these nations spent on their civil defense?
The last time I was in Switzerland talking to the people, they had spent approximately $1,000 US money for each occupant on their shelters.
That is a lot.
Yes, you can make expedient shelters considerably cheaper than that, which are effective against fallout and sunblast, but a good permanent shelter does cost money. And cost studies that we have made in the United States, the in-place costs run in the neighborhood of $700 to $1,000 per occupant for a good blast shelter.
Please talk about the unfortunate status of U.S. civil defense.
Well, the United States has only a token civil defense, really. The Federal Emergency Management Agency that is responsible for the civil defense shelter aspects has only enough budget to plan and study. There is not enough money allocated by Congress to actually implement any kind of an effective shelter program. The United States has conducted tests of shelters on many of the atmospheric nuclear tests, and after we stopped testing weapons in the atmosphere, we used high explosive tests to simulate the blast effects. We've carried out many tests on permanent shelters and expedient shelters since then. We have an excellent technical information base. We know how to build shelters. We've tested them, but we have not implemented it as a national policy.
Therefore, is any percentage of our population protected?
There are some natural shelters. The deep basements of many buildings are quite good shelters. Every home that has a subgrade basement has a limited shelter capability. A number of people have built quite good shelters of their own, either in their house or in the lot adjacent to it. There are many mines and quarries below ground that are good shelters. The federal government has conducted a very excellent survey. It's available on computer data tapes of every major building in every city in the United States, what its rated value is as a fallout shelter, whether it has any blast capability, what utilities are connected to it, and so on. We make use of these in our studies and exercises, and they are quite good. So there is some shelter capability, but it is certainly only a small fraction of the population that have good shelters.
We once had a civil defense. What happened to it?
What happened to it was Congress stopped voting the money to pay for it. You can speculate on the reasons for the Congress neglect, but in fact what we have is a plan for a civil defense, not an actual civil defense.
Like a plan for SDI, but no SDI, plan for ABMs, no ABMs. The problem we have today is that our government has left our civilian population unprotected. And we think that this is a gross irresponsibility of our government, that is to provide for the common defense. I'm wondering what your opinion is on this.
I personally agree. I think defending the population is one of the primary requirements of the government. The counter-argument to that is to say the people are defended, but the way we are defended is by the threat of retaliation against potential aggressors. And that as long as our retaliatory capability is strong, credible, and perceptible to the opponents, that no opponent would ever attack us, at least not in our homeland. That's a valid argument and is good as long as all of our opponents are rational and view the world the way we view it.
That not being the case, and also our awareness that deterrence and MAD have become just about obsolete given the fact that the Soviets have that capability of a first strike, and at this point we're in a bad position. Given all this, don't you think we need some civil defense and some ABMs?
Well, I would like to see both, and in fact we have made studies looking at the synergism between ballistic missile defense, the SDIO concept, and passive measures. And the passive measures are particularly effective in protecting both people, military equipment, and industrial capabilities when combined with a defense system. I would like to see the country go forward with both, with an active civil defense, protection of industry, and implementing a strategic defense against ballistic missiles, and also against aircraft.
I think you're talking to an audience this evening that very much agrees with that posture and recognizes that if the government isn't going to do it for you, you have to do it for yourself. And don't look to the right or the left or behind you, because there's no Uncle Sam there that's going to open up the basements of cities or subways and show you a real civil defense. So we're very concerned about talking about the individual parental responsibility that we have for our children, for our families, for our communities, and for our civilization. We obviously can't raise up ABMs, but we can dig up bomb shelters. And of course, in Japan at the time of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they had bomb shelters. They weren't expecting the bomb. 100,000 people were killed. Had they gone into those tunnels in the cities, those shelters, how much life do you think could have been spared?
Well, there were a few people in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki who by accident were inside the available shelters. Either they had forgotten something and gone into the shelter to retrieve it, or they were in there taking a rest break. But so the survival of the people in shelters was very good. I have no information on what fraction of the population in those cities could have been housed in the available underground shelters. But from the experience of those who were in shelters, I would say that if shelters were available for all of the population, then all of them would have survived. Because these were airbursts, the maximum pressure on the ground directly below the bomb was in the neighborhood of 30 to 50 psi. A good blast shelter will survive that. We expect in any kind of attack that the majority of bursts will be air bursts because they do more damage to buildings and to industry, and that's your primary objective in attacking a city, is to destroy its industry and destroy the ability to continue making war materials. In such cases, a good blast shelter, everyone survives, even directly under ground zero.
And in light of that, what is our government's responsibility in the protection of our citizens in civil defense?
Well, the government responsibility is clearly to protect the citizens. The disagreement is over the method that you use to protect them. I feel that a good shelter program is an essential part of that protection. There are those who feel that the threat of retaliation is adequate protection.
That's a theoretical protection for a physical danger. It's like having a theoretical fire extinguisher in case your house catches fire.
Well, in another way, it is like insurance. None of us expect to have a catastrophic automobile accident or catastrophic medical problems. Nevertheless, it's prudent to have adequate insurance to take care of us in case it does happen.
But the difference is, insurance doesn't stop the accident. It doesn't protect you from it. It only pays for the damage afterwards. The
That's
insurance
true.
we need in civil defense is the protection now.
And a civil defense program would be like the insurance, that it would protect us in case what we don't expect to happen does happen. None of us expect an attack. I don't think anyone here does. I certainly don't in the near future. However, my crystal ball is not good enough to see decades down the future. I can't guarantee that the rulers of all of our potential opponents are always going to be rational. And the only certain insurance policy that I know of is to be prepared if that should happen, and that takes a good shelter program.
So would you say that the government is responsible for protecting all of its citizens with civil defense?
I believe so, but it will only happen if Congress becomes convinced it's so, and that will only happen if enough citizens make it clear to Congress that they are personally concerned, so that Congress will respond to the voters. If enough voters are seriously interested in it by, at the present time, making their own shelters, by making it clear to Congress that this is what they want, then it will happen.
Well, this is exactly what we aim to do, to make Congress aware that we are demanding that the government fulfill its obligation to defend its citizens. Now, is the major obstacle to putting up the civil defense Congress, or is there more bureaucratic red tape than that?
Congress will respond to what it perceives the voters want. The voters are confused. That's our status today. There are a great many people, and they're quite energetic, vocal, they're talented, they write articles, they appear on televisions, who are opposed to civil defense. The primary reason they're opposed to it is they think any nuclear war would be a terrible catastrophe for the entire planet. Their next belief is that the best way of preventing a nuclear war is to make it too terrible for anyone to even think of it. So they try to make it seem more terrible than the reality actually is. So there is an opposition to the United States having a civil defense. So before Congress will respond, then there has to be at least as much effort put in being in favor of civil defense as is currently being expended opposed to civil defense. That means that many people have to expend a lot of effort to make their wishes known.
Exactly what it's going to take. There seems to be an inertia involved in this confusion and indecision, really, both in our perceptions and in our actions. And that's a very strange phenomenon we see in America today. It wasn't that way in World War II. It wasn't that way in other situations in this century. But today it is the reality that people cannot see clearly, and therefore they cannot have a vision and take decisive action to fulfill it. And I believe that the most basic vision anyone has to have is the means to preserve his life that he can hold in his own hands and be in control of. And I think that this is a very devastating situation in this country. I understand that a number of American corporations are quietly making preparations for nuclear war and hardening their communications against EMP and taking other precautions. Can you tell us about this?
Corporate entities, whether they're government entities or business entities, respond to clearly perceived dangers. EMP happens to be a danger that presents itself almost every day in the normal operation of computers, numerical control machines, and so on. Transients on the lines, switching transients, lightning strokes, and so on. All of you who have ever worked in a major computer facility know the probabilities of your computer going down to an unexplained transient on the lines. So there's an incentive for businesses, corporations to protect their sensitive electronics from normal, everyday EMP. The differences between protecting from normal, everyday transients and the nuclear EMP is quite small. So once you've made a decision to safeguard against the normal transients that occur, it's a very tiny additional expenditure to also protect against nuclear EMP. And in fact, the design criteria that we use in protecting our computers in order to meet the everyday type of hazards is entirely adequate to also protect against the nuclear EMP. So it's true. Many corporations are taking these efforts. They're also duplicating critical computer programs, company records, and so on, and storing them in safe places. In fact, there's an industry growing up of companies that simply provide safe storage places, deep underground vaults in mountain tunnels, and so on. So this is occurring, and hopefully it will increase.
Are these same corporations providing for the protection of human life for their own personnel?
Most of the corporations do very careful surveys to look at their buildings and facilities and see where they have underground tunnels. Utility tunnels particularly are good as personnel shelters, and so they do surveys, they put out maps pointing the place to where the shelters are. In a few cases, they add some modifications to the building to make it a better shelter, as long as this can be done at a reasonable cost.
Now, you've also been involved in many studies that investigated the survivability of aircraft and missiles and NATO facilities. And I understand you designed and tested 8 different kinds of personnel shelters. Can you tell us about these tests?
On the personnel shelter test, these were conducted on the high explosive simulated blast test that the United States conducts. When we stopped testing the nuclear weapons in the atmosphere in the early 1960s, we instituted the program of using very large high explosives, 500 tons of high explosive as an example, to generate a blast wave which is quite similar to a nuclear weapon. I have participated and built and installed various kinds of shelters on 5 of these high explosive blast tests. I was interested primarily in investigating the phenomena we call soil arching, where you design a shelter so that the soil which surrounds it will carry most of the blast load when it's exposed to the detonation. To do this, you need a yielding structure, one that will give when the blast load comes on it enough so that the soil will compact, and then this compacted soil carries most of the load. That way the shelter itself needs only be a fraction as strong as it would otherwise. Other people have conducted the same kind of tests. These have all been quite successful. We understand the phenomena of soil arching, the yielding structures, load alleviation quite well. We have computer programs now which model the effects very well. And so we have very high confidence in our ability to design almost any kind of shelter and to be able to predict its response under any kind of simulated nuclear load and how it would behave under an actual nuclear load.
So America has all the technology down to the fine-tuning. All we need to do is do it.
That's right. We have a very good information data bank of how to design shelters, how they would respond, and what kind of life support we would need in them to protect the occupants, while they're in the shelters.
What then is the difference between a blast shelter and a fallout shelter?
For a fallout shelter, you're only concerned with the protection from the fallout radiation. This means if you have shielding material to block the radiation, that's all that's required. You don't need to worry about the blast wave coming down your doorways and your entryways and your air inlets and air exit systems. For a blast shelter, where you expect to be exposed to high overpressures from the blast, you have to put barriers in your entrances, your doorways, your air inlet systems to keep the blast out of the shelter. That means your doors have to be able to withstand the blast. The shelter structure itself has to be able to stand the blast loads, and your air inlets and air exits have to be either designed to baffle the shock wave or to have blast valves in them that will choke off the shock wave.
Why would anyone be absolutely certain that he would not need a blast shelter?
You can never be absolutely certain, because even though a weapon may be targeted at a military target 50 miles away, there's always a potential of malfunction. It would fall in your backyard. But in most cases, if where you're located is more than 10 miles away from the nearest expected military target, there would be no need for a blast shelter. The probability of a lethal blast occurring at that distance is very, very small. It would only happen in case of a gross malfunction, so that a fallout shelter would be adequate. If you're closer than that to a potential, what you perceive as a potential target, then some kind of blast augmentation would seem advisable. And the closer you are to where you expect a target to be, the better you would want your blast shelter.
Do you personally have a fallout shelter for yourself and your family?
I've kept on hand all the materials to make 4 or 5 different kinds of expedient shelters. I continually keep this on hand. I have a complete set of Pioneer tools, shovels, wheelbarrows, picks. My neighbor keeps standing by a backhoe and front loader, diesel-powered machine. We have our plans in hand to construct shelters for both families on a moment's notice.
Oh my goodness. You sound like the American government.
The reason I have no shelter is I happen to also personally be involved in a great many classified studies, and I am egoist enough to believe that I can foretell at least 1 week that the Soviets are not going to attack this coming week. And that's all the time I need.
Why don't you just take a vacation with your family and do it for fun and get the thing in?
I also happen to have a deeply below-grade basement, which is kept well stocked. I accidentally have a quite acceptable shelter purely by accident in my basement. So that's why I haven't built an additional expedient shelter outside of the house. I had planned to construct and in place a permanent corrugated metal shelter just outside of the house. After we tested it on the 1986 high explosive blast test, we did all the preliminary work. We tested the preliminary designs of the shelter on a previous blast test. The Dallas region of FEMA built and tested a full-scale model, and it worked quite well. However, my program came untracked, and I didn't get to participate in the 1986 blast test. And so I was going to order one extra shelter at that time for my own use. So that program got delayed, and it will probably be another year before I actually construct a permanent blast shelter. In the meantime, I feel as long as I have 1 week feeling of security, I'm prepared.
Would you advise us then, who do not have your inside info, etc., to not do as you do, but to do as you say, to go ahead and put in a survival shelter?
No, I would like for people to put in a good permanent shelter. Follow the Swiss example and make the shelters dual use. That is, you design the shelter to be the kind of shelter you want, but you also design it so that you can use it for an extra storage room, playroom, family room. You can fit it up and make a guest room out of it so that you have dual use from the space. I think that is the best approach. And if you aren't able to do that, then various kinds of expedient shelters are very worthwhile.
Personally, I believe it's a very important exercise for us to set an example for our children, to teach them the law of accountability for one's physical survival, and to make it a family project and do exactly what you're saying. It could be a rec room, it could be anything, but we know that in studies of percentages of high school students today, a large percentage of American high school students expect there to be a nuclear war before they're 30 and think they may die before that age. And I think that for the psychological security of children, we have to realize that our fears may not be their fears. I'm not disagreeing with your position and your situation, because I understand why you're taking it for yourself, but I think that the concept of self-defense is so basic to life that it's important for parents to do this so that they, when they grow up, will also not take on the myths that we've discussed earlier, the perceptions that American people have regarding nuclear war, that you grow up with a psychology, we are going to survive. And we know we're going to survive because we've tackled the problem scientifically. We know what the facts are. We know what the probabilities are. So speaking of this, can you tell me what you mean when you talk about protection factor? What is the optimum protection factor?
Protection factor is the ratio of the exposure dose that a person standing out in the open would have received compared to the exposure dose that he receives inside the shelter. A protection factor of 10 then means that if you're inside the shelter and you received an exposure of 1 rad, if you had been outside, you would receive 10 times that much exposure, or 10 rads. For most situations, a protection factor of 200 is sufficient to completely eliminate any potential medical problems from the fallout radiation. And this is the number that is most often quoted in U.S. government pamphlets and so on. Actually, a protection factor of around 50 is enough to save your life in almost every case. The protection factor from fallout is depends simply on how much shielding material you have. Dirt is about the cheapest material you can use, and 1 foot of dirt gives a protection factor of about 10. Since dirt is cheap, easy to move, normally I suggest a protection factor of about 1,000. This means that you have 3 feet of dirt over your shelter roof, and that's sufficient to protect from even the worst possible cases of fallout. An ordinary house gives a protection factor of about 3. A below-grade basement will give a protection factor of about 10. Some very tall buildings, for example, the skyscrapers in downtown cities, the middle floors of those buildings have protection factors in the neighborhood of 50 to 100. That's simply because you're far away from the radiation which falls on the pavement, and you're far away from what falls on the roof. It either has to fall on the roof or the streets, and if you're in the 50th floor of a 100-story building, you're separated from both of them and have very good protection from fallout.
Talking about this protection factor, I think it's one of the greatest gifts that I personally could give to my children. Children who look in the future and say, why is it worth doing anything if a nuclear war is coming? To say, look, you have a protection factor of 1,000 here. You can survive if you have the will to survive, if you make up your mind to survive. That to me is a great satisfaction, to be able to tell this to a child who is taking on the problems of the world at an early age. So, speaking to our children, whether we live in the city, a town, out in the country, or in the wilderness area like this, how do you go about determining where you should build a shelter? And if you're in the thick of a city, should you plan on building it outside the city and then getting to it? I've heard people ask that question. It seems to me quite precarious if a whole city has to drive out of town to get to their shelters. Nobody's going anywhere. What do you have to say about making these choices?
Well, if you live in the suburbs or out in the country where I live, you have to look at where you expect the closest targets to be to your location. If they're several miles away, then it's nearly always the best plan is to make a shelter right where you live, because that's where you have all of your supplies, your medicines, your tools, and you're best able to cope with a post-attack environment. The cities are a very difficult problem, because to have adequate shelters in most of our American cities would take a significant construction program. Cities that have existing subway systems, the subways makes excellent shelters. In some cases, there are deep below-grade parking garages under the buildings. Sometimes in buildings there will be 4 or 5 levels below grade which are used for parking. Those are excellent fallout shelters. The first step would be to make whatever structural modifications to these already existing natural shelters, to make the structural modifications that are required to make them somewhat better shelters, and to provide the life support that you would need for the times that you're staying in the shelter. In the densely populated cities, there simply is no easy answer. The park land is available to make shelters in the cities, but then that takes public action to use the parks to build shelters. Incidentally, the Soviets do this in some of their cities. They use the playgrounds and the parks for public shelters. So do the Swiss. And as some of the Swiss cities found out, where they're very densely populated, they could not implement the shelter program. They had to go outside of the city and make deliberate shelters a short distance away. In American cities, this could be done if you use the property in the suburbs, immediately outside the cities. That's far enough away from military targets. The relocation distances would be small, but again, that would take public concerted action to make use of available land, that's closely adjacent to the cities. I think long distance evacuation is going to be very, very difficult and probably not feasible in a crisis.
So unless there is community action in the big cities, such as New York and Los Angeles, you have a captive population at the mercy of a foreign power's decision to strike or not strike. I mean, if you don't own your little plot of earth, if you're in a high-rise in a city, you really better get active and go after your local city and state government to put up some fallout shelters.
That's right. Where you have high-rise apartments, very little open space, it'd be extremely difficult for an individual to have a shelter nearby. And there are people who have made plans to build their personal shelters in farmlands, someone they know. And in fact, I have talked to people who are planning to use the land that they own to make shelter farms, to build and install and then either sell or rent out a very large number of shelters. I don't know how popular this idea will be, but at least it's being thought about.
Well, depending on what the current leadership posture would be, either we're going to know and be told by the interruption of all media that missiles are headed for a target, they will arrive within 15 minutes or 30 minutes, or fearing panic, we're not going to be told. Now, if we are told and everybody in the city knows at once, it's going to be a mass traffic jam to get to these farm shelters. Then what?
Well, for evacuation to work, it has to be very carefully planned. Everyone has to know what they're to do, where they're to go, and it has to be very carefully scheduled. It cannot be a sudden announcement. It's something that would have to be very well thought out, very well planned ahead of time, and then phased, conducted at the rate that the highways will tolerate. And so that means the traffic control policemen, firemen, and so on have to stay on duty
who of
during
course
the evacuation.
are going to be counted on to stay on duty when their families and their lives are at stake too. That's a big question.
It is, and there is no easy answer to these questions today. Cases like that are going to require concerted public action. The people, all levels of city and government and the national government have to be involved in this.
And of course, I can't even remember when I last participated in a civil defense exercise. It was years and years and years ago, if there ever was one.
Most of the effort in civil defense now is in planning. The budgets, but that doesn't mean that the plans are not good plans. They are. Really.
The best laid plans. The best laid plans.
Right, no. But that's all that FEMA can do. They don't have the funds to do anything else. And so they do their best with the money that Congress makes available to them to make the best plans they can. And I've read many of the plans. I've helped develop some of them. And they're as good technically as anyone knows how to generate. And they're continually improving the plans. They're doing what research they can. And they are training cadres of managers to be able to carry out these plans. However, it's an enormous step, as you pointed out, from plans on paper to implementing any kind of a mass exercise. There have been some examples of doing this, though. A few years ago, there was a dam broke not far from here, over in Idaho. There was no warning. The dam simply broke, and overnight, many thousands of people were evacuated. They had no prior warning. The highway patrol, the local police, the firemen, everyone stayed on duty, did as they were told. And some people had to evacuate as far as 100 miles. There was not one single casualty in that can be attributed to the effects of the lack of warning or the evacuation itself. So it can be done if the authorities know what they're doing and have a sensible plan when they present it to the people. In the case of the broken dam, they did have a sensible plan and the people responded.
So let's do it in every city for every eventuality, beginning with nuclear war. And let's recognize that Americans, from the standpoint of strategic and civil defense, are the most impoverished people in the world. They are the poor when it comes to that. They're not poor in spirit, they're poor in defense. And I think we should give a handout to ourselves and demand that some of our tax dollars go to this very, very serious area. Now, we've talked about the various effects of nuclear weapons. Let's focus on the best ways to counteract each of these effects. And so let me ask you, what's the best kind of material for a shelter? Some people advocate steel cylinders buried in the ground. Others use reinforced concrete. Shelters can be built of aluminum and even wood. So is one type of material better than the rest?
There's no one answer to the best shelter in all circumstances. For expedient shelters, if you feel that a crisis is imminent, then the quickest way to construct it is out of wood. And any kind of wood will do. Ordinary plywood, ordinary 2x4s, and so on. Dig a trench, put a roof over it, cover the roof with dirt. That's the quickest, easiest. It's quite effective for fallout, and there are numerous plans of how to do this available. I have tested a number of designs. Other people have tested many designs. They all work. They're all good. If you have time and the skills, or can hire the labor to build a permanent shelter, then the important thing is to have the shelter below grade if you possibly can. The only time you can't have it below grade is if you happen to be sitting on a solid bedrock or your water table is too close to the top of the ground. Then you have to build your shelter as low as you can and mound the dirt over it. It's important that the shelter structure be what we call a yielding structure. That means that when a heavy load is put on it, it bends, but it doesn't break. The materials that do this best are the corrugated metal kinds of construction you see on highway culverts, railroad culverts, storm drains, and so on. These made of either steel or aluminum, either steel or aluminum work perfectly well. The design has been worked out by the manufacturers to get the maximum use of the material, the amount of steel or the amount of aluminum. They are yielding structures. They work very well. Reinforced concrete with the right amount of reinforcing steel in it is also a yielding structure, also works very well, has been thoroughly tested, and is a very good material. Either reinforced concrete or metal, corrugated steel or corrugated aluminum, are equally acceptable for a permanent underground shelter. It has to be strong enough to stand the blast load you expect to stand, allowing the advantage you get from using soil arching. The soil has to be capable of arching. That means the soil has to be dry. And that's why the water table, why your shelter has to be above the water table. If your soil is saturated, then it will not arch and you get no benefits from the soil arching. Their particular site, your labor, the cost of concrete, the cost of steel, design costs, and so on, determine whether it's best to use concrete or corrugated steel. For a single shelter, a particular design, it's generally best to go to reinforced concrete. I've helped a number of my neighbors design, build, implement their blast shelters, and in every case it turned out that the best choice of materials, the lowest overall cost, was reinforced concrete with plate steel blast doors on it. On the studies that we've done for rapid implementation on a large scale, it turns out that the corrugated metal is best. The reason it's best is because you can manufacture, ship it, store it, and assemble it very quickly. And so it minimizes your transportation and minimizes the labor. So for those kind of programs, I recommend the corrugated steel. But either program, either reinforced concrete or corrugated steel work quite well. You want to avoid any material that has a sudden brittle failure. That's the reason that fiberglass generally is not a good material for blast shelters. When it fails, it tends to fail completely, and you don't want that. If you exceed the load limits on your shelter, you want it to give, deform, but not to collapse completely on top of you.
Would steel be any more resistant to EMP than concrete?
It should be. If you have a complete steel shelter with the doors, with reasonably good contact around the doors, a steel shelter would be a complete shield against EMP.
So if you want that shelter, that's what you should use.
To have EMP as an integral part of your shelter, that's correct. If you need to protect only a small volume of electronics, for example, a few transistor radios that you want to have for communication, you can have an internal EMP shield inside your shelter, and you can make that out of an ordinary garbage can. And with the lid on and your electronics inside, you have a perfectly good EMP shield.
Is that aluminum?
Either aluminum or galvanized steel garbage can. A metal garbage can is a good EMP shield for any kind of electronics that you put inside it.
I can see people putting garbage cans in their houses to regularly store their equipment. I'd like to know what is the best design for a shelter and how you match up weapons effects and design requirements.
There are some requirements on a shelter for the occupants of the shelter. If you're going to be in a shelter very long, you want it to be large enough so that you can stand up in it. In fact, you want to be able to stretch your arms over your head if you want to. So you want the ceiling height to be at least 8 feet. The Swiss did extensive psychological tests on their shelters, and it came up with a minimum diameter of 3 meters for cylindrical shelters, which is approximately 9 feet. And that means you have at least your 8 feet of height, which psychologically is important. The other thing in the shape of your shelter, you want it wide enough so that people can pass each other in the shelter without having to climb up and over the other occupants. Also, it's nice to be able to pass if you have people who are playing cards in one corner. So again, something like an 8-foot width is nice for a permanent shelter. And again, that was part of the reason that the Swiss picked their 3-meter diameter, so that you can pass each other in the shelter without getting stepped on. How strong your design has to be to survive the weapon effects depends on how close to the blast you'd like to survive. I normally recommend a shelter that has at least a 50 psi blast capability, That means if you're making it out of corrugated steel, you need steel which is about 90 mils thick. That's a standard grade of construction steel that's available. If you were making the same shelter out of reinforced concrete, you want the walls 8 inches thick reinforced concrete and the ceiling 12 inches thick reinforced concrete. The shelter will not collapse until overpressures exceed about 200 psi. You need a minimum of 3 feet of dirt on top of the shelter to provide the protection factors you need, and 5 or 6 feet gives you a nice safety margin. And if your location permits 5 feet, that's great. If 3 feet is all you can provide, well, that really is adequate. You have to be careful about the entrances. You have to be careful that you can mount a blast door in your entrance, and that the entrance doesn't degrade the shielding effectiveness.
You believe that blast door should be on every fallout shelter, don't you?
I try to make a distinction between fallout shelters and blast shelters.
But the blast door,
But
don't you prefer it on the fallout
now,
shelter?
When I use the term fallout shelter, I mean a shelter that has no blast doors. So it has no blast capability. It is effective against fallout, and you survive the blast levels up to the ability of the human body to tolerate blast. And that's quite appreciable, by the way. If you're anchored so you don't get thrown against objects, you can tolerate blast pressures of 20 to 30 psi without life-threatening injuries.
What about using a blast door to keep out intruders that are unwelcome, uninvited, and may have the capacity to enter?
Blast doors are strong, and therefore they make a good intrusion aversion technique, but you can make something that will keep out intruders. And for example, a chain link fence as a door will certainly keep out intruders. You can't walk through it, but is of no value at all as a blast door. But any blast door strong enough to stand blast will also keep out intruders. So the dual use certainly is valid. And if you want to survive at overpressures of 100 or 200 psi, then you have to also put blast valves in the air entrainment system. And your air system is extremely important in a shelter. For the occupant requirements, keeping breathing air and cooling air is one of your main requirements. That's true in every time you get a group of people in a large auditorium. Unless you have a good air circulation system, it soon becomes very uncomfortable. And that's very true in a shelter. You don't have much volume in a shelter. If you have very many people in it, it very soon becomes uncomfortably hot and uncomfortably humid. And so you have to have good air circulation. That means large air ducts, and to keep out the blast, you have to have blast valves in those air ducts.
What about camouflage for your shelter? Is that necessary?
The only reason for camouflage for the shelters would be to hide it from the neighbors, and that depends on your neighbors.
Well, as long as there are some who have shelters and some who have not shelters, the have-nots may be trying to get into the haves. In that case, you can always expect that if there are people around who are desperate, you're going to have to deal with desperate situations.
That's true, and as long as we remain unprepared without enough shelters to go around, that's one of the circumstances that have to be dealt with. How people will react in a crisis, the psychologists who study this have divergent opinions on that. Some people will flee, some will freeze, some will panic, and some will steal what their neighbors have.
It seems then that those who have the vested interest in promoting a national civil defense are the very ones who've taken the initiative to have a private and personal fallout or blast shelter. How do you protect those vents? You just told me by a valve, isn't that correct?
Yes.
The filter. Now, the Swiss have a special filter for fallout and chemical and biological agents. What kind of filter is it, and is it worth having?
Well, the Swiss are concerned with the chemical, biological warfare as well as with the nuclear warfare.
Why shouldn't we be?
The economics of delivering chemical warheads simply makes them unattractive as an intercontinental
What happens if they've delivered their first strike and then they land and they decide to take over, and the program is like it's been in Afghanistan and other places in Asia? You move in with chemical warfare, biological warfare.
The kind of shelters that we're talking about are not designed to protect you against attack by an army on foot.
How about terrorists? How about the Khomeinis and the Gaddafis who have a vengeance against the great Satan America? Suppose they send a bundle of terrorists over with chemical warfare.
Again, it's simply the economics of chemical warfare and bacteriological warfare compared to high explosives or compared to nuclear. It could be done. For a terrorist attack, the problem with using chemical or biological agents is simply the uncertainty of their action. They're very dependent upon wind patterns and so on. It's possible that they would be used against a city indiscriminately to hold a city hostage. The probability that they could be delivered against an individual shelter is very low. It would have to be a one-on-one attack against your shelter to deliver a chemical weapon or biological weapon against it. And if they're going to do a one-on-one attack on your shelter, they would probably simply use a handheld bazooka and send a shaped charge right through your blast door. So the only protection against a armed terrorist or an armed soldier on the ground near your shelter is defensive fire. That means you have to be armed, you have to have small armed weapons. There simply is no defense against that kind of attack with any kind of shelter except by active manned weapon defense.
Why then do the Swiss have a special filter for this chemical and biological agents? And do you know about it?
Yes. The reason is the economics for delivering weapons 50 miles is very different than delivering weapons 5,000 miles. And so in the confines of Europe, chemical weapons particularly look very attractive for delivery by short-range aircraft, by artillery, primarily by artillery at artillery ranges. And Switzerland is certainly within those kind of ranges of potential conflicts. So they designed an all-purpose filter. The filter is fundamentally designed against chemical warfare. It also has good capability against bacteriological warfare, and that filter is far more than adequate than what you need for fallout.
Do you happen to know the cost of it?
I'm sorry, I don't know the cost.
Do you know how it works?
Yes, I've used them. I know how they work, but I don't know what they cost. They have a forced air system. The air inlet is outside the shelter, most often in the emergency escape tunnel. Shelters have to have a normal entrance. They have to have an emergency escape entrance. The Swiss usually put their air inlet out the same pathway that they use for the emergency escape tunnel. There's a coarse filter which is designed to filter out dust and would filter out most of the fallout particles. This is very similar to an ordinary furnace filter, fiberglass. It's made so that it can be replaced and disposed of inside the shelter without having to go outside the shelter. Next, the air goes in through a charcoal filter, activated charcoal, and that is to absorb gases and will absorb most chemical agents. It will absorb and trap some biological agents, and then it goes through very fine paper filter to filter out most of the biological agents, and then through a sand bed, fine graded sand bed. And this combination filter is effective against all of the known agents. But for fallout alone, the only thing you need is the first course furnace filter.
Let's talk about the water, sanitation, and sewage disposal systems. How do you protect underground piping for a well or a drain against the earth moving during a blast?
If the amount of ground motion which accompanies the kinds of overpressures we're talking about, say 50 to 200 psi range, the ground motion is not enough to shear off the piping that would be in most wells. You have to be a little bit careful where your piping enters the rigid shelter wall itself. But if that pipe can take bending, then there shouldn't be a problem of shearing off the pipes. If you have a well that's accessible by underground piping, I would not expect the well itself or the piping to be disrupted or sheared off. If you don't have a well, then you need some kind of assured storage of water long enough until you can get to a replenisher supply. The Swiss shelters store their water inside the shelter. They have a tank which happens to be stainless steel, their standard design. It's a rectangular tank, and they hang it from the ceiling of their shelter with standard climbing ropes. And this works very effectively as a shock mount for the water supply. And then they simply drain it out of their storage tank with a rubber tube. And they have a little kitchenette sink in one end of their shelters where they use the water. It takes about a gallon of water a day per occupant of a shelter for minimum drinking requirements. And it can take up to as much as 8 gallons a day for sanitation. Waste disposal is a very serious concern, and you have to think about it and make plans for it. And the Swiss system is they use something that's very similar to what would be to us a 5-gallon plastic bucket. They have a toilet seat which fits over this bucket, plastic liners, and you simply use that as a toilet, similar to the way you do in some campers. And then you need a way of tying off the plastic bag liners and then eventually getting them removed out of your shelter. Crescent Carney, in his book Nuclear War Survival Skills, discusses in great detail ways of providing for sanitation requirements. The book is very good and covers the subject quite well, I think.
You want to repeat the title for us?
The title is Nuclear War Survival Skills. You want to show it on the screen? This was recently republished, in fact only about 2 months ago, and is an excellent discussion of all of the facets required for life support while you're staying in a shelter.
Would you like to show us the rest of your items here?
I brought along a few items just to illustrate the fact that there is an abundance of information available. One of the best publications is called The Effects of Nuclear Weapons. It's a publication of the U.S. Government Printing Office, and it's an excellent compilation of all of the major facets of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapon effects. This is the 3rd edition, and I believe this was published in 1977. It has not been reissued since then. It's a very good starting point for understanding what nuclear weapons do, what nuclear weapon effects are, and includes information on shelter design.
That's available by writing to the Government Printing Office?
Yes, it's available from the U.S. Government Printing Office in Washington, D.C. The Defense Nuclear Agency makes available various kinds of easy-to-use circular slide rules, little calculators, to let you calculate blast pressures as a function of distance from any kind of weapon yield, thermal radiation, prompt gamma, prompt neutron radiation, fallout radiation levels. And they come in a large deluxe model. They come in a smaller model, which has essentially the same information in it. Various agencies put out little specialized calculators for various things. This one happens to be designed to calculate their survival at very high overpressure levels. There are many other government publications and private publications that summarize the experimental tests and theoretical studies that have been done relating to weapon effects. A lot of information is available. FEMA publishes a lot of information on how to build shelters, what's important in survival, and so on.
Thank you for that information. And getting back to the specifics of shelters, what about a fuel source for cooking, food supplies and cooking facility, light source, Geiger counter, and dosimeter?
Well, when you think about building your shelter, you need to also think about living in the shelter. And there are a long list of what I call life support items that are required. You must have food for the time you expect to stay in a shelter. Incidentally, the Swiss do not stock food in their shelters. You go to the shelter, you bring the food with you, or you go hungry.
We noticed that because we went and examined the Swiss shelters. And that's what they told us. Well, you have to get it at your grocery store on the way.
That's correct. They do keep them stocked with water. Incidentally, the average healthy adult can live without food for about 45 days before there's any serious medical problems occur. When people go on starvation diets, nobody dies before about the 60th day, no matter how hard you try. Right, so while food is important, you know, if you think it's urgent to get in a shelter now, it's not necessary to wait to gather up food. Either have some pre-stock, take what you can with you, but it is inconvenient and you get hungry, but it'll be safe to come out of the shelter long before you'll starve to death. Water, you need enough water. You can only go without water for 6 or 7 days, and perhaps not that long if you don't have good ventilation in the shelter. But think of it as going on an infinitely long camping trip. You're going to have to make do with what you take with you. And so everything that you need on a camping trip, you need clothing, you need a way to cook your food if you have food, you need medicines, whatever your particular medicines might be. If you have infants, you need special food formulas, clothing, sanitation facilities for the infants. If you have elderly, you need to take the special needs of the elderly. You need tools. Your house may not be there when you get back. You need to make provision for enough tools for survival, for recovery when you come out of the shelter. You need light, some kind of flashlight. You need communications. You need some kind of transistorized or low power radio so that you can listen in to what's going on in the outside world. You need, there are an endless number of things, and various people have prepared lists. I've prepared lists which I've given to people, others have. There are good lists available in the Nuclear War Survival Skills document. It's as good a list as I know of. So just, you have to think about it, procure ahead of time all the tools, extra clothing, medicines, fuel, light, communications. And to me, one of the major problems is the majority of people have no way of knowing when it's safe to come out of the shelter or when it's important to stay inside the shelter. The only way you can tell that is if you have instruments that are designed to measure radiation. That means some kind of rate meter, some kind of dosimeter. Now there are a lot of them available on the commercial market, and but good ones are expensive.
You've talked about space and the 9-foot diameter. Do you care to add to that on the psychological comfort and endurance? And just how long do you think one should expect to stay in this shelter?
Well, you need to stay in the shelter until it's safe to come out. That's a trivial answer, of course, and you can't tell for sure that it's safe to come out unless you have ways of measuring the outside radiation. We've looked at this problem from the standpoint of being outside of the shelter the maximum time that's reasonable for recovery operations, either recovery for your family or helping recover the industry that you're working for. Normally, under the worst conditions, you can expect to be outside of a shelter safely for about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of 24 hours. At the end of 2 days, you could be outside of the shelter for 1 to 2 hours. At the end of 1 week, you could be outside the shelter for 4 to 6 hours. That's providing you return to the shelter so that the only exposure that you get is during the time that you're outside. At the end of a month, under most conditions, most people could work an 8-hour shift outside the shelter if they were staying inside during the other 16 hours. At the end of 3 months, you can almost resume normal activities, providing you spend your sleeping hours in inside sheltered areas as much time as you can. So it's important to stay inside the shelter while the initial radiation levels are high, but the radiation does decrease very rapidly. In 48 hours, the radiation is only 1/100th as intense as it was 1 hour after the detonation. And from that time on, it's reasonable to spend time outside the shelter doing important tasks. And of course, you don't want to be outside any more than is necessary for your emergency recovery activities.
When you're down under and not knowing what's going on anywhere except perhaps vibration and noise you become aware of, how do you communicate with the outside world? What's the best way to do that? Transistor radio, is that what you said?
Probably the most survivable item that the individual can take are transistor radios with extra batteries for the radios, because there are some protected radio stations. In fact, FEMA has implemented a network of protected transmitting stations around the country. And so there will be some surviving government, some FEMA, some military stations that will be broadcasting, and so it's important to be able to listen to those stations.
And what about a shortwave radio?
Some parts of the Mars network, and which is the military counterpart of the ham radio networks, are undertaking a program to protect their radio equipment. And some of us have written a manual, a pamphlet, to help them design their equipment to survive. And so there is beginning to be a network of survivable communications. The military in the United States has a quite extensive network of communication now, which is survivable, and it's expanding all the time. And so there will be information from that network into the shortwave network, into the commercial networks, so there will be information available. It's far from complete at the present time, but work is underway, and I'm optimistic that we'll have an effective communication system, in place by the time that we really need it.
Have you considered the adaptability of shelters of any kind for things like earth changes. There are vast earth changes predicted for these centuries. If you're underground, for instance, I don't know how far underground, you might be able to cope with tremendous surface turbulence in the weather and in earth shifting. What do you think about that idea?
Well, of course, if you're trying to protect yourself from atmospheric disturbances, if I understand your question correctly, then any amount of burial is deep enough. I mean, you don't need to go any deeper than 3 feet to be completely safe from atmospheric disturbances. So there's no necessity for going very deep underground for that problem. The likelihood of any major atmospheric disturbance, earth disturbance, seems to me to be very remote. I don't see that as a real concern, at least in the foreseeable future that I can foresee.
Even earthquake or land movements of any kind, or even flood or shifts in the poles, or all these things that people talk about and don't really know if they're going to happen, the oceans rising, etc.
The one thing that can happen suddenly is earthquakes. And for earthquake protection, you need to be protected from falling debris, and then have a way to get out if you happen to be in the path of falling debris. So you would want your shelter to be strong enough to survive the collapse of the nearby buildings. And there are criteria that have been developed for that, incidentally, by the Soviets, on where to space your shelters to protect the occupants in case the buildings around them collapse. And their criteria is take the nearest building, take 1/2 of the building height and add 10 feet, and then that's the distance you put your shelter entrances from the building walls. And I've not seen any other country develop similar criteria. If an earthquake should occur, if you're protected from the falling debris from the buildings around you, then your next concern is to be able to get out of your shelter once the earth starts shaking. And so that means you need to have at least 2 entrances. You need your normal entrance, and if that should be blocked by falling debris, then you want an emergency escape that you can get out of. And you need tools inside, crowbars, picks, shovels, to help you dig your way out if that's necessary.
I was going to ask you about the tools, the ultimate tools of digging your way out of, let's say you're in a good blast-proof shelter in Armero, and the mudslide comes on top of you. You could actually dig your way out if you had the right tools.
Yes, I think it's important that in the shelter you have what we used to call pioneer tools. That means axe, shovel, pick, crowbar, pry bar, hammer, saw, those kind of things that let you move rock, saw through boards, hacksaw if you have metal doors that you may have to cut your way through, and so on. Probably the other sudden calamity that may happen to some people are floods. And if you live near a floodplain of a river, in that case, underground shelters are generally not a good idea in case of floods.
Get up in the mountains, get up to the hills, and don't stay near the floodplain.
That's right. A boat would be a better survival aid than an underground shelter.
How about a Noah's Ark?
However, if you think about it, and where you live, the hazards that you may be exposed to, earthquakes are certainly one, fires that may occur suddenly, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes. In much of the U.S., tornado is a much greater hazard than anything else. The kind of shelter that provides good protection against these is already about 90% of the kind of shelter that you need against nuclear weapons. So in the old days on the farms where I grew up, every farm in Kansas had what we called a storm shelter. It was designed specifically for protection against tornadoes. Those shelters had about 1 foot of earth cover on them. They were generally isolated from the house, 20 or 50 feet away from the house, halfway underground, halfway above ground. All that would be needed to make those into a perfectly adequate fallout shelter would be to add another couple of feet of dirt on top of them. But people have quit building what we call storm shelters. They rely instead on the highway patrol, the local sheriff, with the radio. In case the local weather bureau has a tornado alert, then the sheriff and the highway patrol go up and down the streets with their sirens and their loudspeakers saying there's a tornado alert and whether to evacuate or not.
Well, if there is an alert, why wouldn't you want to have an underground shelter from it?
Shelter would be much better, but people, because there is an alternate way of going, which costs nothing, many people have opted to not expend the money for a storm shelter and rely totally on the warning.
Well, people in Armero relied on the warning, and it didn't come. So the town fathers decided there was no imminent danger of that huge mudslide or of the volcano going off.
The situation, it would seem prudent to have at least storm cellars if you're in a tornado area. But the situation is very analogous to what we are nationally with nuclear weapons. It would seem very prudent to have shelters for the people, but instead of that, we're relying on the threat of retaliation to prevent the attack. That's fine as long as it works. And you've brought up the point, which I believe very strongly, we can't be sure it will work. You may not get the warning. The deterrent could possibly fail. And then it would be extremely important to have the shelters.
Well, do you ever remember going down into one of these cellars when you were a child?
Yes, I do. The one I remember most clearly was the parents could see the tornado coming. I could not. We were all to go to the storm cellar, which was about 50 feet from the house we lived in. And I dawdled along the way. I was about 3 years old at the time, and found that I could not walk against the wind. And so finally my parents came back and carried me into the shelter. I remember that quite well. It demolished our barn, some of the fences, and completely missed the house.
Did you have the sensation of the tornado passing when you were underground?
No. All I could hear was the noise. Being 3 years old, I had no idea what a tornado was. I've since once seen a tornado pass by, perhaps a quarter of a mile away from where I was watching it. It was very dramatic to watch it. And you could hear it slightly from the distance I was, but I wasn't close enough to hear the very loud noise. This particular one happened to come across the field where we had just harvested wheat. In those days, we had a binder and a thresher, and all of the straw was put into one large straw pile. It came directly across the straw pile and sucked the straw up into the funnel, and this black funnel suddenly turned a brilliant gold color from the straw in the funnel. And it was very dramatic. I was very impressed by watching this.
Well, did it ever deposit the straw?
Yes, it left a trail of straw about 100 yards wide for about a mile on across the farm.